Welcome back, everybody, to the Renaissance Humanism podcast. In today's episode, I will be discussing why France is a second-rate power, why it's always been a second-rate power, and always been the second most powerful nation within Europe since the 14th century. The reason for this is twofold. Namely, it's the English fault, as well as the fact that France, typically throughout its long history, always missed the mark. And it's all got to be important as well that France is a continental power first and a sea power second, even a distant second. In the 14th, well, I would say in the 13th century, the reason why France was the most powerful kingdom in Europe, and particularly Western Europe, was because during the 13th century, during the rule of King Philip II of France, known as Philip Augustus, from 1180 to 1223, and then his son Louis VIII of France, called Louis the Lion, from 1223 to 1226. He only reigned 6 years. That's Louis the Lion. See, Philip II and Louis the Lion, during their rule, they centralized power in France. Philip Augustus, he kicked the Plantagenets. They were the kings of England from 1154 until 1485, where Richard III, England's last Plantagenet king, was defeated at the Battle of Bosworth by Henry Tudor, which marked the start of a Welsh dynasty ruling the Kingdom of England and Wales from 1485 until the death of Queen Elizabeth I of England in 1623. Now, the English, the Plantagenets, when they lost the Dukedom of Normandy, they lost the counties of Anjou and Maine, they lost Poitiers, and lost the Greater Aquitaine. They got reduced to a little sliver of land called Gascony. And in the 13th century, the massive expansion of the French crown lands, which included Normandy and Poitiers and other French lands. And it was those lands that helped to increase the power of the French. They gave them more money, more taxation, and ability to operate as the undisputed power within the Kingdom of France and within Western Europe. So throughout the 13th century, the French were the top dogs. And then in the 14th century, that's when things started to go wrong. The Patian Dynasty, this is in the male line, from 987 until 1328. The crown was passed successfully from father to son to father to son, the eldest surviving son. And in 1328, that no longer, 1328 that didn't happen because when Louis the Fourth of France died in 1328, the previous kings of France were Louis the Fourth of France. He reigned from 1285 until 1314, I want to say, 1314. And he was replaced by three of his sons. That was Louis the Tenth, Philip the Fourth, and Philip the Fifth, and then Charles the Fourth of France. Now, each of those sons, particularly from Philip V, they bypassed the daughters of Louis X of France, then bypassed the daughters of Philip V of France. So that marked twice the crown bypassed descendants of the female line. That's why when Charles IV died in 1328, the crown went to a descendant of Philip III of France, who was the father of Philip IV, and it passed to the king who would be Philip the Sixth, marked at the beginning of the Valois dynasty. Philip reigned from 1328 until 1350. Now, Philip, he was the son of the Count of Valois, Charles, and he was in turn the son of King Philip III of France. So you can see where the problem is starting now. They bypassed the female line, and they had two claimants to the throne. One was Edward III, the King of England, of the House Plantagenet. Phil Edward was the descendant of Philip IV, and the other candidate was Charles the Bad of the Kingdom of Navarre. Charles, he was the direct descendant of Philip IV's eldest son, Louis X of France. And that's what started one of many reasons for the Hundred Years' War, which lasted from 1337 until 1453. This was also part of a series of wars waged between the kingdoms of England and France since before the Norman conquest, when William the Conqueror was just a Duke of Normandy. He fought wars against Henry I of France due to Duke William becoming a more dominant power in northern France due to his marriage with the Count of Flanders' own daughter, Matilda. He also conquered the county of Maine in 1063, followed 3 years later in 1066 by his conquest of England. But because of this, that sparked the conflict between both crowns. Henry the First of France, my apologies, Henry the First of France from 1031 until his death in 1060. He was an ally of William in the 1040s. Then he turned against William due to William becoming more dominant in northern France, and that sparked the wars between England and France from the 1050s all the way until ending and enduring the Second World War. So you're talking nearly 900 years of rivalry, warfare, and both kingdoms, both nations trying to undermine each other. For instance, during World War II, the British gave away French colonies and French overseas territory without asking the French. In turn, the French also provide weapons to Israeli terrorists. So it was backwards and forwards, and there's a bit of origins and how long the conflicts actually been going on between these two nations. Now, in the 14th century, the French, as terms of the most predominant military power and most militarized nation within Europe, they were replaced by England briefly during the Hundred Years' War, notably during the rule of King Edward III of England from 1327 to 1377, then Henry V, who ruled briefly between 1413 and 1422. Under Edward III, England briefly conquered southern France, reclaiming the Aquitaine, and under Henry V, they successfully conquered northern France, only to lose it during the reign of Henry V's son, Henry VI, who was king from 1422 until he was deposed in 1461, then came back briefly in 1470 to 4, no, not 1470, 1471, briefly. Uh, Again, because of that, in terms of power, France was engulfed in a century of warfare, over a century of warfare, and therefore was distracted, couldn't expand into other places in Europe, and was replaced briefly as the most dominant power in Europe by the English. And then we have the late 15th and 14th centuries, 14, 15, and 16th centuries. And then the Valois dynasty, they were engaged in the Valois-Habsburg Wars from 1493 to 1559. In that time period, France had a population of between 16 to 25 million. Up until the 19th century, France had the biggest population in Europe, and they got a lot of its power, a lot of its wealth from its taxation, ability to tax peasants. Also, some great geography as well, land. France had the protection of the Alps and the Pyrenees. It was vulnerable to the east through the Low Countries and past the Rhine River. That was a vulnerability. But because France being the most powerful nation in Europe, they were facing the Habsburgs. They controlled the United Kingdom of Spain. They controlled Central Europe on paper, being Holy Roman Emperors, and also controlled Austria, Hungary, and northern territories in Italy as well. And because of that, the French were boxed in again. They couldn't expand, they couldn't exert influence because there was a new power block in Europe. These were the Habsburgs versus the Valois dynasty. And that was the case up until the 17th century. Then in the 17th century, French were also then fighting the Dutch, who were briefly in the 17th century and throughout the 15th century built a sizable trade empire. Again, the French failed to defeat the Dutch, partly due to the English providing funding and resources to the Dutch. And also in the year 1688, a Dutchman called William of Orange became King William III of England and began the Nine Years' War from 1688 to 1697. Again, stopped France from gaining control of known countries, gaining control of the Netherlands. So again, France missing the mark again. And in the 18th century, France spent the equivalent of 45 years out of 100 years at war, so it's nearly one war every year in terms of time frame. And because of that, they got increasing into your debts. For the British, they had the Industrial Revolution beginning in the 18th century. Historically, the date tends to be marked as 1769, and also it gave England the wealth, the British the wealth to fund France's enemies. And finally, uh, French geography, French, they are an Atlantic and Mediterranean power, and also to link up their fleets, they gotta go through the Straits of Gibraltar. What this means in practical terms, the French don't have the ability to combine their forces into one fighting force. They're gonna have their fleets split into two. For the British, they had the ability to concentrate their military power at sea due to being an island nation, meaning they can move their ships around, and the French just couldn't do that. And also because France was often engaged in continental wars, either expanding on the continent or defending its territory. That meant that ultimately France was ground down due to the English ability to fund their enemies, and that the French could never actually directly invade England because they didn't have the actual sea power to do that. I think that pretty much covers this topic. I hope you found today's episode interesting and informative. Thank you for your time and consideration, and peace out.